so I'll get started. Hello, everybody. I'm Elisa, and I'm an event staffer at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I would like to welcome you to PNP Live. We appreciate you joining us today in this virtual format in the midst of these continuously extraordinary times, throughout all of which we've been working to bring you the authors you love and their new books to our PNP community. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase The Last Confessions of Sylvia P. directly to the Politics and Prose website. If you look near the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A, and you can click there to submit questions to the author. We'll try our best to get to everyone's questions, but we apologize in advance if we run out of time before we get to yours. We'll also be providing closed captions if you click on the CC link right next to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So before we begin, I would like to say thank you again for being here. We're deeply grateful for you all helping keep our business and our spirits afloat. And now I would like to welcome to PNP Live, Lee Kravetz, celebrating the release of his book, The Last Confessions of Sylvia P. Lee Kravetz is the author of the novel, The Last Confessions of Sylvia P., as well as acclaimed nonfiction, Strange Contagion, and Super Survivors. He has written for print and television, including the New York Times, New York Magazine, The Atlantic, Psychology Today, The Daily Beast, The San Francisco Chronicle, and PBS. The Last Confessions of Sylvia P. imaginatively brings into focus the period of promise and tragedy that marked the writing of Sylvia Plath's modern classic, The Bell Jar. Lee Kravetz uses a prismatic narrative formed from three distinct fictional perspectives to bring Plath to life: that of her psychiatrist, a rival poet, and years later, a curator of antiquities. Kravetz will be in conversation with Tom Barbash, the author of 4 books, as well as reviews, essays, and articles for publications such as McSweeney's, Tin House, and the New York Times. His most recent book, the novel The Dakota Winters, was a national bestseller and named as an editor's choice by the New York Times Book Review, Oprah Magazine, Rolling Stone, and People. Please join me in welcoming Lee Kravetz and Tom Barbash to PNP Live.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa. And I can't tell you, I did tell you, Lee, what a treat it was to read this book. It's so smart, it's so inventive. And for someone who, my book had the challenge of bringing John Lennon to life on the page, and I understood the challenge you were up against to do that with Sylvia Plath and how you brought it off so brilliantly. And I have so many questions about the way in which you structured this terrific book. But I thought maybe, before we get into the conversation, because for those of you who haven't read it, it really is, it's like 3 separate worlds and novels that coalesce beautifully. But we have the character Estee, who's working at an auction house, who has found a manuscript that may have been penned by Sylvia Plath. We have a rival of Plath's from workshop days, Boston Rhodes. That's her pseudonym. And then we have the psychotherapist Ruth Barnhouse, who is working, who's serving as Sylvia's friend and doctor, when she's at McLean, the famed McLean Hospital. And each has its own world, its own culture, in a sense. And I marveled at your ability to move back and forth, between the 3 of them. But I thought to give everyone sort of a taste of the difference between the different characters, you might read just a short section of each. Is that okay, Lee?
I think it sounds wonderful. Tom, thank you. And thank you, Politics and Prose. And it's just wonderful to be here with you. And to actually do this with you is such a thrill because, and we can get into it. I said earlier, I used the Dakota Winters as a huge sort of model in terms of how to do this. Because this was not an easy thing to do, talking and writing characters who are real people and real icons into another form of into fiction, and do it well. So I was like, Tom, you're the person I know who did it well. Let me see if I can emulate this and do it to the best of my ability. So yeah, this is the book, and I'll give you just sort of a real quick taste of each of the point of view characters, just a paragraph or 2 from each. So this is Estee, the modern day curator. And she is, I'll just start. The safe holdings room at the St. Ambrose auction house has no windows, 2 late 19th century oil paintings on the back wall, a small wood table, and privacy. the most valuable item in the archive. As her master curator for the house, I introduced myself to Elton and JJ, the Dice brothers. Elton, wearing a gray street jacket, blue jeans, and a t-shirt that reads, "Free beer, it's what's for breakfast," asks, "What's a master curator?" Think of my role as not merely that of a broker, but as a kind of archaeologist, a purveyor of restoration, a butler to history, though my essential utility is that of a caretaker, performing one's calling with decorum and formality. Pellegrino? All right, so that is Este's sort of tone. And we go back about 50 years to Boston Rhodes, who becomes sort of Sylvia Plath's rival. And this takes place in 1958. And when we meet her, she's actually writing a letter to Professor Robert Lowell, who's her poetry instructor. This is a taste of her. "My dearest Professor Lowell, I've moved in and out of the realm of confession so many times. Only now at the end have I found my strength. For your kindnesses and because you were there and don't yet realize what you saw, no one deserves the truth more. You see, I fear you've bought into a false history. I want to set you straight. I want to tell you my part. You once said, we poets are detectives, that we are to call attention to the details ordinary people see every day and overlook, to carve out secrets as one uses a spoon to gut oysters. With this letter, it is my hope that I can set things right. I will point your eyes to the details you have overlooked. There was intent, there was motive, there was a weapon." So that is Boston Rhodes. And let's see, and this really quick is Ruth Barnhouse, who is the professor. The psychiatrist who sort of works with Sylvia when she first meets her at McLean Hospital. "I used to play Sinatra records on the Admiral for my daughter, Tiffany, and I would sing along with them. I can still hear her voice. Her favorite song was Sunflower. She's a sunflower, she's my sunflower, and I know we'll never part. She's a sunflower, she's my one flower. She's the flower of my heart. The song has been in my mind, entrenched there as it were, since Superintendent Frisch transferred me from Min's Belknap to the ward of Codman Manor." I'm gonna jump over here real quick. "As I moved along the first floor corridor, I detected a doleful whistling coming from one patient's room. It was only as I neared room 19 that my ear deciphered the tune. It was Sunflower. Glimpsing a girl no older than 20, I now saw that my whistler was curled into a rocking chair. The toes of her slippers poked out of a red wool blanket. Her hair was chopped short, pelt-like and patchy. Another woman was in the room with her, I noticed. Dressed in pearls, white gloves, and a wide-brimmed structured hat, the other woman was in fact fussing over a vase of sunflowers. The girl in the rocking chair seemed to hold no more strength than those cut stems. When I got around to asking my fellow nurse the name of the patient in room 19, she said, 'Who, Miss Plath? Why, she's only the most infamous girl in New England.'" There you go.
I love all those have questions, all those sections you just read that come to my mind. I wondered, is that a song that Plath actually cherished in some way? So
yeah, so Sunflower. So it was interesting. When you read the bell jar, there's all these little details that sort of get mixed in. And in one particular scene of the novel of the bell jar, she actually sings Sunflower. Yeah. And so I was like, I really want to use that. I want to show that this song somehow has some sort of significance to Sylvia. Of course, her character in the bell jar is called Esther Greenwood. And so I sort of mixed the two together. I actually had to get the rights to use that song.
Yeah. It's funny because, in mine, I knew all the different things that John Lennon was reading, and the books that he read. And so the things he might say. So I was thinking he's got to have had that somewhere. And that's great that it came from that.
Oh, thank you.
So auction houses in the book business, you write like an insider there, and you capture this. I love all the sorts of, because it's not simply about this manuscript. There's so much talk about the biz, in what feels like insider language. And I've had friends who are sort of obsessed with old manuscripts, and they go to bookstores and try to find neglected treasures. What was your homework to capture that with authenticity?
I was going to ask you the same question actually about the Dakota. I mean, did you grow up in the Dakota? Did you?
I grew up 5 blocks away. Yeah. And I've been there a couple times, but yeah.
Okay. So you sort of, you get some sense of it from people around you, from your experiences. I talked to a couple of people, mainly though it was mostly narrative driven, in the sense that in my head, I sort of fictionalized it and realized I needed to get some grounding into it. So I did do a little bit of homework. But I'll tell you, one of the things that actually became really fun to do, Esty, who's sort of the curator, we kind of go through her past and we see these other objects that she has sort of uncovered over the years and the significance of these objects. And that was actually sort of like red meat for me as a sort of a fiction writer. I was like, I want to sort of find objects that may have actually existed, put a backstory to them that did not exist, and then sort of insert them into the curator auction house sort of machinery. And that sort of, I think, is what brings that whole section to life.
What it made me think, have you seen that movie with Melissa McCarthy, where she plays a writer who's down on her luck, and then she starts forging letters of famous writers?
Yep.
The whole marketplace for it's a certain sort of person just goes nuts for that, and it reminded me of that particular world in a sense.
There are people. I mean, that's one of the things that I was really curious about when I sort of dug into this was, art and artifacts. Can we actually own them? Why do we want them so badly? Why do we want to pay so much for something that seems so insignificant and yet it carries so much weight? I mean, that's sort of the idea behind celebrity. There's not a lot of weight in real life behind these celebrities, and yet that we hold them in some place in our psyche that is almost unexplainable. Sylvia Plath was absolutely one of those, those writers, those artists who was around for, only 30 years. And, when she died, she leaves this sort of this gaping hole in our reality, in our world. And we sort of fill that hole with a mythology that it becomes who she is and who she may or may not have really been. And I think, John Lennon was the same way.
I was thinking it's so similar. These people that died at a young age, and who so much there's so much thought, so much written about them, so much speculation about their lives.
Did you see Yesterday, the movie about if the Beatles had not existed?
Yeah.
There's a whole scene at the end. I'm not going to ruin anything. Well, it's been out, so I'm going to ruin it for anybody who hasn't seen it yet. But there's a scene at the end where we visit John Lennon as though he had not died. And, I left that movie wondering, would John Lennon really be as significant in real life if he hadn't been with the Beatles and hadn't done this whole fame thing?
Yeah. I didn't like that depiction of him, because John seemed to me to have so much more of a kind of electric brain than he's sort of left with, in that he was sort of, I don't know, there was a dullness to that depiction. But
I felt the same way.
I don't know. I mean, and part of what you're writing about too is there was a book written a while ago by Joshua Wolfshank. It was called The Powers of Two, but it's this idea that there's a myth of the lone genius, and that most of the people, the great people that succeed, do it in the company of others, who push them. And that a lot of what your book about, I think, is that, what happens within the workplace, the workshop, but also even what happens between a doctor and patient, and what it does to one's power to be articulate about their own experience, and that clearly with Lennon and McCartney, there's all this sorts of stuff of Paul having pure pop music instincts and John having that edge, and the collision of the two being kind of perfect. But
I think there's something to that. When I started out, I decided, I knew there was going to be 3 storylines, because I wanted 3 different sort of ways of people responding to an artist coming along, and both responding to her art as well as influencing it in different ways. So the psychiatrist in the novel discovers Sylvia when she's really at her lowest, and she's having she's diagnosed manic depressive or bipolar disorder, and she can't read, she can't write at this point. She's really just out of it. And we see sort of this psychiatrist come along and teach her how to tap into her most raw, self, and describe things that most people are telling her not to talk about or even think about. And then you have the rival who sort of sees her as a competitor and pushes her in a different direction. And so I was really curious just how these forces would sort of work together to shape the genius that Sylvia became.
But I love the dialogue that you have in their exchanges, though. I mean, this one line I love. I don't know. I mean, it's just what you came up with when Sylvia's with her doctor, and she's kind of irritated with her, and she says, "Can you even call this treatment? It's more like mistreatment."
That's exactly it. Yeah, exactly. And Sylvia, even when she was at her lowest, has a wonderful pep to her voice, a certain edginess. It was almost like everything that she sort of thought came out through the prism of Sylvia Plath. I mean, that was what made her so wonderful. Before we started talking today, on this forum, we talked about like sort of we have to, when we're writing about people who are geniuses, try to step up to that sort of place where, we have to think the way they do and hope that we get it right. And they're as smart as they are, as funny as they are. Writing dialogue for Sylvia Plath, you take it really seriously. It's a really tough thing to do. And it's terrifying because if you screw it up, it's, everything falls apart.
I had the same fear, with writing Lennon, especially with my British publisher, just thinking, how am I going to pull this off? I mean, I have a couple friends who are British writers, who helped me a little bit, and would send me videos with from Liverpool of like sitcoms from there to try to get everything down. So it was kind of fun.
Well, you did. I mean, I was not nearly as brave as you were. You wrote whole chapters of dialogue with John Lennon, and it felt so authentic and so true. I felt with Sylvia, like she appears in all three storylines, but I was very careful about when she spoke and how she spoke. I think you were just incredibly brave with how you pulled that off, because it feels so real.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah. But yours too. And one of the things, that surely helped you in the process was your experience, right, as studying psychoanalysis and working I did my homework too here of at the very mental institution where Ken Kesey was sweeping floors, and where he began writing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. That's a big. You and I have experience. I was a Stegner fellow, and I saw that you talked to the Stegners. I think, is that right?
I did.
Kesey was a Stegner fellow, and that was when he worked, up in that hospital, and that's when he started Cuckoo's Nest. But talk about that how your knowledge of Dr. Barnhouse, how that arose from some of your own experiences, if it did.
Yeah, it absolutely did, and it's true. I was trying. Anybody who knows me knows I wanted my whole life to be a novelist. I went so far as to work in the publishing industry for about 7 years in New York, or 5 years in New York. And by the time I hit my early 30s, it was like, well, I don't know what I'm doing. And so I decided instead to go and get my master's in psychology, which turned out to be terrific because it gave me some real insights into certain things. And of course, during my postgraduate work, I wound up working at the psychiatric ward. And one of the things I learned, kind of going through it, was there was a real split in the mid 50s about how treatment was done with patients. Before the split, you had sort of the strict Freudian sort of practitioners, and they were very, very, very by the book. And then after that mid 50s split, what you had was more of the humanistic sort of the personal approach to therapy. And we moved into different forms of medication. We moved into different forms of sort of experiential treatment that today are just as prevalent as the Freudian techniques. I didn't want to get into that too much in the book, but I did want to show that split. And Ruth Barnhouse, who is and was in real life one of the very first female psychiatrists in New England and possibly even the country, I wanted her to really represent that sort of new way of approaching psychotherapy and treatment, which is how, we see Sylvia sort of find that spark of insight that becomes, the bell jar in her poetry. I'll tell you, when I was working at the hospital, I walked in, and where the patients are sort of sitting in the waiting room, there was a kiosk of old paperback books. And when you're there, you don't want to think about the fact that you're in a mental hospital. So the fact that the bell jar was actually in that kiosk was sort of like, the lending library was sort of this sort of stark moment. And I started reading it, and I had read it years ago, and I'm rereading it now. And it occurs to me, it's not just the story, the veiled memoir of Sylvia Plath's experience, which is what the bell jar became. It's also sort of the parallel story of the birth of confessional poetry. When we think about poetry today, we think about the personal I, we think about the rawness and the emotions and the thinking that kind of goes into this poetry, But before confessional poetry came about, that really wasn't the case. We had things like, the surrealism movement, the romanticism movement, the metaphysical movement, the graveyard poets. But when it comes to poetry that's confessional, it's almost it's almost like a person talking to his or her therapist. That didn't start until Sylvia Plath's sort of era. And what struck me was that it wasn't just Sylvia who was writing this, but it was also Robert Lowell and Anne Sexton, who also found themselves in mental hospitals at the same time. And I was like, wait a second, this whole movement started in mental hospitals. That is a story. That is an incredible sort of wealth of I don't know, it's a journey you want to go down. So that's what started the book.
It's amazing. And I had a different sort of experience, but also concerning mental health and characters, which was, and you start to write it, and then all of a sudden things that you're putting into your book, you realize already exist, in the histories of these people. But I had this idea of, one of the things I was looking at is the father of my protagonist, is a talk show host who has a nervous breakdown. And then I was seeing that everybody in that era had what they called a nervous breakdown, and it manifested in different ways. But all the talk show hosts, including Dick Cavett, who was a big influence, on my character, and David Susskind, all these people. Then the journeys that it was something like, I think you had, as you had this sort of discovery. All of a sudden it feels like there's this connection between what you're doing on the page and what you're getting fed through the research.
I love that. Actually, I was rereading your book before this again, and it dawned on me that the Dakota Winters actually has some of the same DNA as the bell jar in many ways, because it does have Buddy, the character having a nervous breakdown. You have, your main character sort of revisiting New York the same way that Sylvia Plath's character sort of visits New York when she's, younger. And so I basically what I'm saying is, Tom, you wrote the bell jar again. You just rewrote it.
Awesome. Awesome. I wanted to read a quote, because you have a couple every once in a while, and I love this when you create a character to think about those things that from their research that linger in their brain. But she quotes Freud sometimes, and so there's this quote that you have, November 20th. Freud once said that of all human obsessions, the strongest is a desire to habitually rely on memory, when the truth is that memory is full of holes. We fill those holes with ghosts. And I wanted you to it clearly has import in the book, and what that means to you now that you're sort of done with the book, and a lot of this is about whose memory can be trusted, etc. So
that theme sort of goes throughout. We talk about the Stegner Fellowship. Adam Johnson talks a lot about the trauma narrative, and not to get too in the weeds, but the idea is that if we're traumatized, and who isn't traumatized by something in their lives, one of the telltale signs of trauma is that there's holes in our memory. And yet when we are being treated for any sort of trauma therapy, we rely on our memory, but our memory is inherently flawed. That's the whole sort of cyclical nature of trauma. There's another theme in the book about bees, and the idea that, at one point, Dr. Ruth Barnhouse takes her charges into the fields behind the ward, and they start working with bee houses. And so there was this link, between like holes in memory and the shape of bees sort of flying around these bee boxes, and the idea that we think that we can contain mental illness. We think that we can contain trauma, we can treat trauma and cure it. But the reality is we can't. We learn to live with it. Sometimes we have, pockets of time where we can sort of live with it as opposed to trying to crush it out. And I do think that there's it's an esoteric link between the two, right? Like memory is flawed and the idea of being able to treat mental illness is flawed. So I tried to sort of bridge that with narrative. It's much clearer in the book.
Did you ever, and because it's kind of funny because I sort of did this with John, but did you ever think of how you might have treated Sylvia if you had been the doctor, what your dynamic with her might have been? Did you step into that role in some way, sort of?
God, that is a great question. I never really did. I saw myself more as a curator in this story than as the psychotherapist or psychiatrist. I like to think that the psychiatrist or Ruth Barnhouse actually did what I would want to do, which is, take Sylvia out of the the Freudian sort of approach. Like in real life, what happened to Sylvia was she went into the mental hospital. She went to McLean Hospital, and she was hit with electroconvulsive shock therapy and also insulin shock therapy. And both of those measures work. They do, at least for a short time. When I was practicing, therapy with my patients, what I really appreciated was the ability to sit down and see the person within the illness. And, in real life, I don't think that Sylvia got that chance, except when she did meet Ruth Barnhouse. And in the reality of her life was that Sylvia left McLean Hospital and maintained a relationship with Dr. Ruth Barnhouse for a decade. And it was in their letters back and forth that and their occasional meetings where they actually moved outside of that sort of Freudian approach. And I think that's where Sylvia sort of found herself and was cured. And I think that I would hope that that's where I would have gone with it. But at the end, the tragedy of her ending was sort of almost inevitable from the very beginning.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I love that. I had, I sort of psychoanalyzed the Beatles in that, and my son went to school with one of his friends. The mom was a marriage counselor. And so I had a coffee with her and tried to approach John and Paul's relationship like a marriage, and then asked her like, what suggestions? And I'm still convinced that the differences, even after watching Get Back, they all love each other, and they're small and they're mostly based on misunderstandings. They're like when you see people that love each other that are having a stupid fight, you just want to get them past it. But I wanted to move on to Boston Rhodes, who I just love this. And now, were you ever in a writing workshop, first of all? I mean, like, did you go to a graduate MFA program?
I didn't. The closest I ever got to a graduate MFA program workshop was through the San Francisco Writers Grotto, which I think you may have been a part of.
I was there forever. Yeah, I was one of the original gang. So
it's great. I mean, it's a great institution. It's been around for almost 25 years now, and I've had the pleasure of being a part of it for about 10. I've taught at that. I've been a student in that, and the way that sort of works is, there's all these sort of sort of workshops, and it's like 10 or 15 people around a table and you sort of do the workshop work. I was always terrible at that stuff. I've always been terrible at it. And I sort of, if anything, sort of put myself in Boston Rhodes' sort of headspace. When we first meet her, she's begging to get into Robert Lowell's workshop. And I just assumed that she would be as bad as I was in workshop, meaning I wouldn't know how to critique. I just would know how to like basically crumple up and want to hide. So I think that that's pretty much where, these scenes sort of come from. She comes at it from a place of complete vulnerability. I had some great teachers when I did that. I never had one quite as, as stark and dynamic as as Robert Lowell per se, but Robert Lowell, I mean, what was wonderful about him as a writer and as a human being was he was incredible. He was one of the founders of confessional poetry. What he does, you can read his work today and it still has relevance and truth to where we are, even though it was written 60 years ago. But what I loved, diving into with him was that he was also this flawed human being who was also suffering from manic depression. And we really, have an opportunity to sort of see him go through that sort of experience on the page. And so inside and outside of that workshop just seemed like this crazy experience to me that I had to write about.
Oh, it's great. And one of the things is, when you write about an icon, like you and I have done, what you don't want to do is do hagiography, just have everything. And through Boston, I mean, I can feel your reluctance, but it's sort of fun. Like every possible ungenerous interpretation of everything Sylvia Plath does is uttered, by Boston.
Yeah.
One thing, I don't know if you've read a book by Lan Samantha Chang, who runs the Iowa Writers Workshop, called All Is Forgotten, Nothing Is Lost.
No, I've heard of it though.
Oh, you got to read it, because it really is, in many ways. I mean, it's about a workshop, and it's also about that quality that's in there of wanting to be noticed by someone, like Lowell, and that there's a woman poet, who's the subject, and these male poets in that book become intense rivalries for her attention, and it's gorgeously, it's really, really well, and it reminded me. I mean, Sam Chang has such experience, and you capture it in a way that felt right on.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could talk about the little quotes in the front of the Boston Rhodes chapters. She had, it's like she's quoted herself, and they each is more Boston Rhodes than the one before. Can you talk about the inspiration for those?
Yeah, somebody asked me in one of my earlier interviews if I'm a poet, and I'm not. I've never, before I really got into writing this novel, I knew just enough about poetry to get myself in trouble. And so obviously part of my job as a researcher was to sort of go into, the mechanics of poetry and really sort of understand that world. And I sort of walked away with I think a fairly firm sort of grasp of it, but I still, I don't consider myself a poet, but one of the things I sort of do, and this is going to sound more metaphysical than I mean it to, but I do this sort of thing that's sort of method writing, if you will. So what I'll do is I wrote each storyline originally separate because I needed to stay in character, so to speak. And I got into sort of the soul of who Boston Rhodes is and was. Literally, I would take my phone and dictate into it using her tone of voice, and just to really understand how she lives and breathes and sees the world. Much like a cognitive behavioral therapist will try to get into the thoughts and feelings and behaviors of that patient. I really wanted to understand Boston. And at some point, you have to, if you're writing about a poet, you have to understand how they're going to write poetry. And so at the start of each of these sections, you do have these sort of snippets of poems that Boston Rhodes writes, and they sort of lead you into her kind of spiral of venom and anger and vengeance with each particular poem. If you ask me where they come from, I don't know, except to say that they really do come from Boston Rhodes in the truest sense. And there they are on the page.
It's such an insight into, though, because it's like the darkest manifestation of something that exists within all of us. I mean, the novelist David Mitchell, he likes to say that he writes from lust, and he says he reads something and he lusts to have written it, in some sort of way. And Boston, so in a productive, in a sort of generous way, you see how much she wants to have had the thoughts, and the sentences of Sylvia, who she sort of wills herself to loathe, and then through that we have to believe in the intensity of that experience in order to understand the sorts of things she ends up doing. But I think that the brilliance of what you've done is we can all sort of imagine that headspace. You know, they have all these conversations about how to send out manuscripts, right? Whether you do sort of, and which I have with my students, the multiple submission, you know, and what,
Right.
and there's all this sort of insider stuff that you've got. And Sylvia's quite generous, the Sylvia that you've created with her. And that almost drives her even more crazy, right? So
that's exactly. So Sylvia is she's good. I mean, she's naturally good. When we're writing about real people, you know, I think we have this sort of contract with, you know, this sort of social contract with the person we're writing about in fiction. If this person is real, Sylvia, John Lennon, Yoko Ono, you know, Dick Cavett, all of these people sort of have to have, we have this contract where it's not that we're going to put them in the best light. We're going to put them in a realistic light. And Sylvia is, you know, in real life was just this, you know, was up and down in every way. She was passionate, compassionate, angry, sad. And so I wanted to sort of make sure that I captured that. But it's true, Boston Rhodes has to be just like Sylvia Plath and the exact opposite. So what that means is they look and sound the same, but when Sylvia says something that's so pure and honest, and Boston Rhodes agrees with it, it just drives her even more crazy, and it pushes her to this, you know, to the extreme in every scenario. You know, so I think that's sort of how I approached her character. And going back to David Mitchell, his work absolutely, I will tell you, influenced the way that I sort of structured this book.
I saw that. I saw some of Cloud Atlas with, you know, with the Frobisher letters, you know, I mean, the fact that you have letters as a form and you allowed yourself this different way of, you know, these distinct ways of telling the story.
Oh, he's absolutely. There is no one quite like him, although there are so many books out right now, which I discovered only after, you know, I started working on mine, that sort of use that sort of approach. I mean, Cloud Cuckoo Land is very similar to that approach. Appleseed, which came out about a year and a half ago, the same sort of thing, where we sort of take different sort of ways of approaching similar stories across multiple eras of, you know, for a much larger canvas. I think those stories are fascinating and fabulous.
Yeah. You know, so many books have grown out of Cloud Atlas, including, I mean, I did an interview with Ishiguro like ages ago. There's a name drop.
But there's a good one.
Yeah. But Never Let Me Go grew out of kind of envy of reading Cloud Atlas and seeing the clone story, you know, and then he just decided that he wanted to do something completely different.
Are you kidding? I just got chills. I had no idea. And what's so interesting about Cloud Atlas, I mean, Never Let Me Go, is that tonally it's so different. So you can see the DNA in there. You totally can.
Yeah. So I love little bits like with the cultural references to Truman Capote sozzled. There's a good word. That seems like such a madman world on screwdrivers. And then, you know what I love, and then the reference of Charles Van Doren. I mean, little information is we grew up with the Van Dorens. So and I didn't know this. Like, I was a kid, I remember suddenly I had this like 50s memorabilia book, and it was all about this Charlie Van Doren who was on 21. I was like, I'd ask my parents, is that Charlie? Because he was friends with my parents. You know, and he was a tennis player, like, you know, and I played doubles with him. I mean, it was just crazy, you know. And then, he's the perfect, well, which takes me to this question, which is, you know, because it's in a reference of who Ted Hughes was, and I sort of think of the challenge with me. Ted Hughes, I don't think is a huge part of the book, but Ted and Sylvia, their presence, you know, and there's this moment where Boston is seething. She's so funny. She says, oh, it seems like Sylvia mentioned Ted like 6 times, you know, it's like, it's her husband, you know, like, and so,
right.
But if you could talk a little bit to what the presence in the poetry community in terms of the gossip, in terms of just the weight of that marriage, you know, in the world.
Well, what's interesting, thank you. Charles Van Doren, the fact that, you know, he was sort of this fraud, you know, I mean, that was exactly.
He wasn't, Lee.
That's right. He was,
because he was the star professor. He quite clearly could have known all of those things. And the story is really interesting, you know. But go on. Yeah.
No. I mean, this is the stuff. I love this stuff. This is as you know, when we're doing historical fiction, especially during sort of the more recent historical fiction,
Yeah.
this is the stuff that is just so interesting to me, because these are fascinating characters and fascinating stories where truth is fiction, and it's just, you just want to dive into that world. If you know, when it comes to Ted and Sylvia, at this time, Ted is more famous than Sylvia Plath. In 1958, 1959, 1960, where Sylvia is in Robert Lowell's workshop, Sylvia is well known, but she's not world famous yet at all. You know, she becomes world famous much closer to the age where she is when she dies, and in fact becomes world renowned after she dies. Partially because Ted Hughes takes all of her manuscripts and posthumously starts publishing them. And you know, the Bell Jar comes out under Sylvia's real name only after she dies. So you know, Ted Hughes was absolutely sort of this rock star character. So you have Ted Hughes and you have Sylvia Plath together, and boy, that is just this sort of marquee couple. And so when you have someone like Boston Rhodes and everybody else who's really in Robert Lowell's sort of workshop, of course they're going to be fascinated by who this couple is. The myth becomes bigger than who they really are. And of course, the real gossip is, well, how do we find out who they really are? And can we be a part of that circle? And I think, you know, you talk about the lust and longing for that world, and wishing you had written something like that. And I think in that world, as I think we still do today, we want to be a part of not only that, you know, that the fiction that they write, but also the people who write them as well. We want to get close to that circle as well. Ted Hughes always gets a bad rap when it comes to Sylvia Plath, for fairly or unfairly. In this book, I really wanted to show him as a fool more than anything else. This is not a guy who, at any point, do we have the impression that he knows really what's going on in any part of his life. When Sylvia dies, which is sort of you know, it's not the huge part of the novel, but when Sylvia dies, he still doesn't understand what happened. Sylvia's relationship to the people in the workshop, her relationship to poetry, he still doesn't really have a firm grasp of who she was, even though they were married.
Yeah, and there are still people who you know, with any sort of benign description of them will make them pissed off, I'm sure.
That's exactly right.
So we've got some questions from the audience. Here, and I'll share some of them. So just the original. How did you choose Sylvia Plath as your subject for the novel? Someone asks.
Yeah, it's you know, we all carry, I think, once you read, you know, certain writers, they sort of live in your mind, in your body and soul. They never quite leave. I read Sylvia Plath. I think I must have read her when I was a kid. I don't remember the exact moment I read The Bell Jar, except that I just always sort of knew, you know, what, you know, she's always sort of lived in my head. It really was going back and working in the mental hospital, which, by the way, you know, yes, Ken Kesey worked in that same facility. What's amazing is that the building he worked in and swept floors in is right next door. It's still there. It's boarded up. It's basically a condemned building, but you can actually still see it. I think when I walked into that building and had, you know, the 2 years I spent working in that facility, you kind of carry that sort of there. If you're looking for it, you see that sort of spirit of literature and inspiration.
Yeah.
Exactly it. Maybe there's some madness there that I caught, but that was definitely the inspiration for it.
Here's a question related to that. How did your notions of how the book would be change as you learned more about her, or did you do all your research prior to developing the story?
You know, boy, that's a wonderful question too. You know, I started out thinking to myself, I'm just going to follow the beats of the Bell Jar. And within the first draft, I realized I had to abandon that completely because, you know, the Bell Jar is considered it really is a thinly veiled look at who Sylvia Plath was, but it's not all of her. And in fact, it's really just a very sort of thin layer of who she really was. In order to really sort of figure out how to flesh out this novel and how it changed, I read every letter that she wrote, every biography that came out about her, letters that Anne Sexton wrote to her, and poetry about her. And what that does is it sort of built a three-dimensional view of who this person was. And that became the whole point of the novel, which was I wanted to understand Sylvia Plath from other people's perspectives, not just the story of Sylvia from her perspective. And so I sort of thought of it. Someone had this description once, and I really appreciated it. This idea that you have multiple people blowing smoke into a clear box, and the outline that sort of forms around this person in the middle is Sylvia Plath. And that's how the novel really sort of changed in my mind as I wrote it.
Yeah, I mean, I had a similar challenge with John and Yoko, and I guess it sounds like maybe, I mean, you can tell me if you had the same sort of thought, but I sort of thought that there was a place for, with all that had been written, it seemed to fall into either hagiography or an attack. And there are books that really attack John and Yoko viciously, and there are other books where they walk on water. And I thought there was something between that, something there, and I also I was just struck by his wicked sense of humor. And
so you made him seem, I mean, he was so human. That was the thing that I took from your book when I started working on mine, was I wanted to capture the sense of, how human she was, these sort of moments. We see Sylvia at one point actually cooking a meal for people and bringing the food out, and sort of feeling nervous because, Ted is there and there's all these sort of things happening. You do that so beautifully with John Lennon that, when they go out together, when they go fishing, when they go out into the world together, it's this very intimate, sort of very human sort of moments that also sort of captures his thinking and sort of makes the character much deeper. And we understand John Lennon in a very, very different capacity by showing him outside of the places we usually see him.
Yeah. And for me, I mean, I was trying to, usually you're answering an interviewer's questions, but what if you're driving the conversation, what are you thinking about? And for him, he was obsessed with going to sea, because of his dad, and also he learned how to sail, and he actually took that trip to Bermuda. But that was one thing. And then he was obsessed with like who, he was obsessed with Elvis, that idea of how many people share your experience, and one of the people that you can look to, whether you want that life or not, was Elvis Presley. So you begin to think of like, where would their brain go in conversation? And I'm sure you did the same with Sylvia. So. That's
exactly it. And you sort of have to take the liberty and ask permission in some ways to get into that character's head and say, I hope I'm doing this right.
Yep.
So, yeah.
So I know that I have students on the link here, or on the Zoom here. And I'm wondering, if you could talk a little bit about, I talk about it a lot because I want my students to be men and women of letters, I say, and to be able to go back and forth between fiction and nonfiction. Yeah. And I think they your ability to write nonfiction and research and put that into a dramatic context, I'm sure it's clear from your answers how much that gave you an advantage as a novelist. But can you talk about going from one to the other?
Yeah, I absolutely. It's a great point. Since I was, not a joke. I've wanted to be a novelist since I was 7 years old. And so I've worked really hard to do it. And then of course I got into the book publishing industry and was working with some of my absolute favorite authors. And I realized that I had nothing to write about. I didn't know what to write about. I didn't know anything about the world. I felt like I knew a lot about a little about a lot, but I didn't know what to write about. And it wasn't until I got into sort of I started to learn about psychology that all of a sudden I had something to write about and dig into. And I wouldn't say I'm an expert at it, but certainly it gave me something to talk about. And so when I first started out, my first book was actually, it was my graduate thesis that actually sort of HarperCollins was kind enough to sort of say, oh, we could do something with this, and turned it into my first book. And that launched me into finally becoming the writer that I had always wanted to be. And, you always start off with this, you have the guardrails of fact, and you can sort of dig into the fact. But I'll tell you, and yes, there's a lot of differences, obviously, between nonfiction and fiction. But again, the DNA is the same for me, is that when I'm writing nonfiction, it has to be told in story. Everything has to be narrative driven. You have to show everything. the building blocks of fiction are the same as wonderfully written nonfiction. And so I tried my hardest with the nonfiction. Not only, you get the facts and you do the digging and the research, which is awesome. It really is a lot of fun. But when you're building the narrative nonfiction, you really add the narrative to it. I never wanted to stray too far from that. And then, so even when you have a chapter where there's a lot of facts and figures, I always sort of dove into that using scene and stories. So there was tension, there was moral need and psychological need. There was an antagonist, there was a protagonist, there was always tension within that scene. And then when you leave the narrative and put in the facts and figures, they add detail and richness to the scene. Eventually, I was able to take that and leverage that fully into fiction. And so again, it's using the same principles. And I think, like, if you can, that's what I would recommend. If anybody were to ask me, how do you go from fiction to nonfiction and back and forth? Actually, it's the same technique, except with fiction. And this is really important. When I was working with fiction, the minute I let go of the constraints of reality, all of a sudden it freed me up in such a way. I realized I didn't have to adhere to the facts completely, just the spirit of the facts. And that's I think the only difference between fiction and nonfiction.
Yeah, I've gone back and forth between the two, as well. And I've done talks, about using research, the risks, everyone says, I think there's, you and I can both talk about this. I think there's this idea that you don't want to go down too many rabbit holes. People will say you don't want, and there's some truth to that. But on the other hand, I think that you want to do enough research so that it looks like you haven't done any research. I mean, that you just, John Irving, he did a talk at Stanford a while back, and he talked about the fact that the 4 books that had been heavily researched, everyone thought were autobiographical. And then he wrote an autobiographical book and everyone thought it had been researched, and so it's just that he and that maybe that's our goal, right?
I think it is. It totally is. John, I'll tell you, when you read something like, The Prayer for Owen Meany, or, the Cider House Rules or something like that, the Cider House Rules in particular, it feels like nonfiction. Because he does. He goes into the history of the abortion clinic and the adoption house. He goes into the mechanics of the cider house, and it does feel like it's so real, and yet it's 100% fiction. I mean, right. That's absolutely true.
Yeah, and that's the best compliment if someone says, "Oh, if they've said to me, so you grew up on TV on a TV show," you're like,
you're like, nope.
You're just like, thank you. You don't have to say anything more than that.
You'd be like, right? How's Buddy doing?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there were a lot of Google searches on him. I want to talk about, or I was wondering if you hit the point with the narrative lines of these 3 books.
Yeah.
Ondaatje has talked about his process and how messy it often is, and that he reaches a stage in which, because he does all this stuff where he's playing with chronologies, etc. And at some point he thinks, I'm absolutely 100% not going to be able to finish this book, and it's a big effing mess. And I'm wondering if there was a point as you were going, because I saw in one interview you said that it sort of came together as a Rubik's Cube, but I would bet that didn't happen right away, and that you did hit that point, as we all do, of despair, where you're wondering, what in the world, made me think I could do this? So.
Oh my gosh. Well, there was about 4 years of that.
Yeah.
I went through 11 drafts, and of course, I made formal drafts. Every single one of them, there was a period of time where I took every scene and I put it on a scrap of paper. There's a picture of it somewhere that I posted, where I took every scene and then I laid it out on my long dining room table and just sort of moved it around and was like, it makes sense to me. I don't know if this is going to work at all. Every single time I'd go back to a draft and I'd realize that, wow, this particular scene doesn't work. Okay, I can fix that. Because of the clockwork nature of this particular story, every scene in the present influences the scene in the past. Everything pushes everything forward. If you make one little change, it has this ripple effect, and you have to go through and change everything. So every single draft of this novel took months because it was so intricate. And then, of course, you've got to go back and make sure that it doesn't feel intricate, it feels smooth. And my biggest concern throughout this was like, well, it makes sense to me, but I'm really concerned that it's going to look like a giant mess. And then finally, you take a look at it, you take a step back and like, okay, you don't breathe. You hope that it holds together, and then it slightly does, and then you start building around it and building around it and building around it, and all of a sudden it becomes the body of the book. But I mean, I have notes upon notes upon notes of almost like map drawing.
Yeah, it's crazy, and we all do it, and it is, and it is so. I don't know, is it joy in some ways? It's such a relief when it comes together in some way, because it looks, it's almost surprising to you that it does, right? It's just.
It's a miracle. It totally is. I mean, it's sort of like, it is. It's like, okay, it works. I have this theory of an idea of a possibility that this thing might actually look like something kind of cool, might work, I don't know. And then when it finally does, you're like, it is a relief. That first draft where it's barely holding together, and you can step back and go, you can breathe. It's sort of, it is joy, it is relief, and then you can start to build from there.
I think this is a compliment to you that this question is occurring to me this late in the interview. Yeah. But I was going to ask you about writing from a woman's point of view. I mean, I think that you do it. I'm not a woman, but I know lots, and I completely believe the women in your book. But whether that was at all a challenge, to you, because some people don't even try it. So.
I thank you for asking that question. It's actually, I think that one of the most important questions, not to me, but in general right now. I mean, it's a really delicate question, and an understandably delicate question to answer, not just in our day and age, but just in general. It's me, sorry. But no, really, it's tough. If I started out thinking, if someone had told me I'm going to write a book about Sylvia Plath from the perspective of 3 different women, I would have like immediately talked myself out of it. But it didn't happen that way. What happened was I discovered that each of these main point of view characters needed to be women. And I didn't approach it from the perspective of I'm writing from the POV of 3 women. I actually approached it as a psychologist would. I was really curious about how the art affected different types of people. The fact that they wound up becoming women in the novel was just a matter of sort of symmetry and necessity. Dr. Ruth Barnhouse, who was a real person and I knew needed to be a point of view character in the story, was obviously female. I needed a rival who was exactly like Sylvia Plath, but also opposite. So they needed to look the same, act the same, come from somewhat similar backgrounds. So I knew that it needed to be a female character, hence Boston Rhodes. The modern storyline of the curator was the toughest one to crack, because I went through, originally that character was male, and it just wasn't working. It wasn't, the symmetry was wrong, the tone was wrong, the desire was wrong. The character just didn't work. And so I tried it out as a female, and all of a sudden it clicked. So in terms of, you talk about that Rubik's Cube sort of clicking into place, that was really it. It was like a 3-sided Rubik's Cube. It all came together. And then I approached it as a therapist would approach any other sort of patient, which is, who are these people? What are their desires? What's getting in their own way? And that's how I sort of developed the voices for these individuals. And it, to the extent that I succeeded, you'll have to tell me, but I felt really, I took it real seriously, because that could have been a major problem if the tone wasn't right.
Right, and I was thinking about the potential problem of a kind of blending, but I don't think you have it, and I think the reason is because the sort of driving desires of each are so distinct. You have one who wants to be her or vanquish her. Mm-hmm. You have another who wants to understand and help her, and then someone else, who has her own motivation of sort of making her name off of this manuscript, so that they're different, and that those different drives, it seems to me, probably kept them distinct? Is that?
That's exactly what it was. They had different drives, they had different voices, they had different oppositions, different forces pushing against them throughout. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what did it. I was worried about that too, but very clearly and very quickly, they started to become very sharply drawn characters in their own shapes and own molds. The tone of voice, the desire throughout, the things that were getting in their way, their desires from the beginning to the end, their arcs are all different. They all start off at very different people from each other and come together changing similarly, but so you'll have to see.
Yep. Well, I've just been alerted. We're alerted that our time is coming to a close. I feel, Lee, like we could talk for the next couple of hours, but to all of you out there, get this book right away. It's absolutely wonderful. And hi, Alyssa. Thanks for. Hi. Yeah, hope we didn't go on too long. So.
Oh no, that's all right. I'm sure everybody is loving it. I do want to say thank you both, Lee and Tom, for taking the time to be here today and for that really wonderful and engaging discussion. I'd also like to thank the audience here today, as your patronage is what really allows us to bring you programming like this. And we wouldn't be able to continue to host these events without the book sales to support them. So please support Lee Kravetz as well as Politics and Prose by using the link which we posted in the chat to purchase The Last Confessions of Sylvia P. directly through our website. And then be sure to keep an eye on our current event listings, as we have plenty of excellent events to attend virtually and now in person. Thank you again, Lee and Tom, for joining us today. Keep well read, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.